이시키스모.
She laughed in his face, in front of her entire executive team, in front of airport staff, in front of God, and everyone. Vanessa Whitmore pointed at the man in the dirty maintenance uniform and laughed. "You fly my jet." What she didn't know, what nobody knew, was that the quiet white guy holding a wrench had once landed a crippled experimental aircraft at Mach 1.3 with one engine on fire and both hands bleeding. And in about 40 minutes, she was going to find that out the hard way. If you're watching from your city right now, drop it in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Don't forget to subscribe, because this one goes all the way. The morning started the way most of Ethan Carter's mornings did, quietly, efficiently, and completely invisible to everyone around him. He was on the tarmac at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport by 5:45, same as always. Steel-toed boots, navy blue work pants with a grease stain on the left knee that hadn't fully come out since the Tuesday before last. A name badge clipped to his chest that read, E. Carter, Ground Operations. The kind of badge that told people exactly how much attention to pay him, which was none. He liked it that way. He had a system. Check the hydraulic lines on gate C7 first, then swing around to the fuel manifold at C9, then log the overnight reports before the morning shift supervisor came in, demanding them like he'd personally invented paperwork. It was a good system. It kept his hands busy and his mind quiet, and quiet was something Ethan Carter had spent the last 6 years chasing, like a man who knew silence was the only medicine left on the shelf. At 6:10, he stopped by the break room, poured himself a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been brewed during the Clinton administration, and pulled out his phone to check the one message that actually mattered to him. Dad, Liam's lunch is in the blue bag in the fridge, not the red one. Mrs. Patterson said red bag kids go to the allergy table, and Liam says that's embarrassing. He smiled. His neighbor Carol had sent it at 5:30 right after she'd come over to stay with Liam while Ethan made his shift. 6 years old, and the kid already had opinions about cafeteria social dynamics. Ethan typed back blue bag. Got it. Tell him I'll be home by 4. Love him. He pocketed the phone, finished the coffee, and walked back out onto the tarmac. That was the life. That was the whole life. And if you had asked him, really sat him down and asked him honest, he would have told you it was enough. He would have meant it mostly. The Whitmore Aviation Private Terminal was 40 yards from Gate C, 9 separated by a chain-link fence, and about $4 million worth of difference in clientele. Ethan had walked past it 1,000 times. The jets that came through there were different animals than the commercial birds he maintained. Leaner, quieter, built for speed and comfort, rather than cattle volume. He noticed them the way a retired carpenter notices a well-made chair. Professionally, without longing. He noticed the commotion at 7:22. As it started with voices, which was unusual, because the Whitmore terminal was usually as hushed as a funeral home. Then it escalated to what he could only describe as controlled panic, the kind where people are moving very fast, but trying very hard not to look like they're moving very fast. He wasn't going to get involved. He kept walking. Then he heard someone say, "He's not breathing right," and his feet stopped moving before his brain gave the instruction. He turned, and through the chain link, he could see a cluster of people in expensive suits gathered around a man on the ground near the base of a Cessna Citation Longitude. One of them, a woman in a charcoal blazer, dark hair pulled back so tight it looked like a statement was on her phone, voice clipped and cold even in crisis. "I don't care what it costs. I need a pilot. Now. Dude." A man in a white captain's uniform was sitting against the wheel of a luggage cart, an oxygen mask over his face, 2 paramedics working on him. He was conscious, but gray. His hands were shaking. Ethan stood at the fence and watched for exactly 4 seconds. Then he walked to the access gate, badged through, and approached the group. "Excuse me." Nobody heard him. "Excuse me." Louder this time. The woman on the phone turned. She had the kind of face that had probably been beautiful once and was still striking now, but had somewhere along the way traded warmth for efficiency. Her eyes ran over him in one flat second, the boots, the stained pants, the badge, and dismissed him in the same motion. "This is a private terminal," she said. Not rude, just definitive, the way you'd tell someone the library was closed. "I know. I work here. Ground ops." He nodded toward Captain whoever he was against the luggage cart. "What happened to him?" "That's not your concern." She turned back to her phone. "Yes, I'm still here. What do you mean no one is available until noon?" One of her colleagues, a younger man with a tablet and the harried look of someone who'd been awake since 3, stepped toward Ethan with his palms out. "Sir, you need to step back. We have a situation." "I can see that." Ethan looked past him at the pilot. "Cardiac event." The young man blinked. "We think so. Look, I really need you to. Is he stable?" "They think so, but—" "And you need to be in the air." It wasn't a question. "Sir." The woman lowered her phone. She turned back to Ethan with the specific expression of someone who has run out of patience for the universe and is now cataloging new annoyances for later. "Is there something I can help you with?" she said, each word separated by the kind of deliberate spacing that means the opposite. Ethan looked at her. Then he looked at the jet. Then he looked back at her. "I can fly it," he said. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Vanessa Whitmore laughed. It wasn't a small laugh. It wasn't a polite, dismissive chuckle. It started somewhere genuine, that involuntary burst that escapes when something strikes you as so absurd that your body reacts before your manners can intervene. Then it kept going. And that was when it became something else. 2 of her executives exchanged looks and smiled. A third, a woman in a red blazer, actually shook her head slowly, the way you do when a child says something adorably incorrect. "You," Vanessa said, gesturing at him with her phone. "You can fly my jet." "Yes." "You're she looked at his badge, "ground tech." "Today I am." "That is," she glanced at her team sharing the moment, "that is genuinely the most." She stopped laughing, collected herself. When she looked back at him, her eyes were flat and professional and about 7 degrees below zero. "Sir, I don't know what you think you're doing, but I have a very sick father in a hospital in Savannah. I have a pilot who just had a cardiac event on my tarmac, and I have a cabin full of senior executives who need to be on the ground in 40 minutes. I do not have time for whatever this is. I'm going to ask you once, please step back." "Your next available charter is how far out?" Ethan said. She didn't answer. "I heard you on the phone. Noon." He looked at his watch. It was 7:29. "That's 4.5 hours, which means your father has 4.5 hours less than he needs." Something moved across her face. Just for a second. Then the armor came back. "You'll fail miserably," she said, flat, final. "I'm not putting my life and my company in the hands of a man who fixes hydraulic fluid leaks for a living." "That's fair," Ethan said. "You don't know me." "No, I don't. And I'm not interested in knowing you." "Boss." He reached into the chest pocket of his work jacket. He almost never wore it anymore. The reflex to carry it was just muscle memory from a different life. But he'd grabbed the jacket this morning because it was colder than forecast. And inside the chest pocket behind a folded napkin, with Liam's crayon drawing of a rocket ship on it, was a wallet. Inside the wallet was a card. He held it out to her. She didn't take it for a moment. Then she did. It was an FAA airline transport pilot certificate. Current, his name on it, and below that, partially visible through the worn plastic sleeve, another card. Military ID, older. A different Ethan Carter in the photo, younger, harder, in a flight suit with a patch on the shoulder that she didn't recognize because most people never would. But the man standing across from her in the red blazer recognized it. He stepped forward, looked at the patch, and went completely still. "Ma'am," he said quietly. Vanessa looked at him. His name was Dennis Pryor. 15 years as her head of aviation operations, and she had never once seen his face do what it was doing right now. "Ma'am, that patch is—" He cleared his throat. "That's the 413th Flight Test Squadron. Edwards Air Force Base. So, she said. Dennis looked at Ethan. You flew at Edwards. For a while, Ethan said. X-planes. Pause. Among other things. Dennis turned back to Vanessa. There was something in his voice now. Something careful, like a man who wants to say a lot more than he's saying. Ma'am, I think you should let him fly. She said no twice more before she said yes. And the second no came when one of her other executives, a man named Hargrove, who had strong opinions about things he didn't understand, suggested they simply drive to Savannah instead. 4 hours by road. Vanessa had run the numbers in her head before he finished the sentence. Her father's doctor had called at 6:45 this morning. Come now, he'd said. Come as fast as you can. A doctor who tells you to come now is not describing a 4-hour situation.
Bawantay.
The third no wasn't really a no. It was a silence that lasted about 8 seconds, while she stared at the jet, and then at Ethan, and then at the card in her hand, and then she closed her fingers around the card and looked at Dennis. If anything goes wrong, then it was going to go wrong no matter what, Dennis said. Ma'am, there is no good option here. There's just this one. She looked at Ethan. If you kill us. I won't, Ethan said. That's not a guarantee. No, he agreed. It's not, but it's the truth. She stared at him. Whatever she was looking for, she apparently found enough of it to satisfy her, because she handed his card back without another word, turned on her heel, and walked toward the boarding stairs. You've got 5 minutes to run your pre-flight, she said over her shoulder. Don't make me regret this. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say you were right. She certainly didn't apologize for the laughter. But she walked up the stairs. And that was its own kind of answer. Ethan stood at the base of the boarding stairs for exactly 1 moment after she disappeared inside. Geez. He looked at the jet. The Cessna Citation Longitude, a long-range bird twin turbofan cruising altitude up to 45,000 feet, comfortable in most weather conditions. He had flown worse. He had flown much worse. He had flown aircraft that the engineers who designed them admitted were basically controlled experiments in how much punishment a human body could withstand before the decision stopped being voluntary. He put his hand on the fuselage. The metal was cool and smooth under his palm. 6 years, he thought. He pushed the thought away. He walked around the aircraft, running the pre-flight with his hands and eyes, the way it had been drilled into him back when drilling things into you was someone else's full-time job. Fuel levels, control surfaces, landing gear assemblies. He checked the pitot tubes, checked the static ports, checked the engine inlets with a small flashlight he kept on his belt for maintenance work. Every single thing was exactly where it was supposed to be. The aircraft was immaculate. Of course it was. Vanessa Whitmore clearly didn't do anything halfway. He climbed the stairs. Inside the cabin, 6 people in expensive clothes stared at him, some with fear, some with confusion. One Hargrove with open contempt, his jaw set like a man who had registered his protest for the record and intended to keep registering it indefinitely. Ethan walked past them without a word, ducked into the cockpit, and closed the door behind him. He sat in the left seat. He put his hands on the yoke. And for the first time in 6 years, Ethan Carter felt the particular terrible beloved sensation of the world becoming very simple. No paperwork, no grief, no carefully maintained invisibility, no 6-year-old boy's lunch bag colors to remember. Just the instrument panel laid out in front of him like a language he'd spoken before he could walk, and the sound of 2 Rolls-Royce AE 3007C engines waiting to wake up. He keyed the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. My name is Ethan Carter. We're going to Savannah. Flight time is approximately 40 minutes. Please be seated and buckle your belts. He heard Hargrove say something through the closed door. He didn't catch the words. He didn't need to. He reached for the checklist binder, flipped to page 1. Began. The tower gave him clearance at 7:44. Ethan taxied the Longitude to the end of runway 10 with the same quiet authority that he brought to everything, not rushed, not tentative, just present and accurate. Over the radio, Atlanta Approach was running their standard morning traffic management, the familiar back and forth of identifiers and headings and altimeter settings that had been the soundtrack of a decade of his life. He ran through the takeoff checklist with the door still closed, talking to himself in a low voice, the way pilots do when they've done something so many times that the words are less reminders than they are ritual. Flaps set, trim set, transponder on, flight instruments cross-checked. Behind him through the door, he heard the cabin go quiet. He brought the power up. Power. And the engines answered immediately, smooth, responsive, exactly as advertised. The aircraft rolled forward, then faster, and he felt the moment the wings began to argue with the ground for custody of the machine, and then without drama or ceremony, the mains lifted, and they were airborne, and Atlanta fell away beneath them. He raised the gear. He retracted the flaps on schedule. He climbed through 3,000 feet, then 5,000, then handed off to departure control and banked southward toward the Georgia coast. Smooth. The whole thing was smooth. In the back, Vanessa Whitmore sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes closed, and tried not to think about the last time she'd seen her father at Christmas 6 months ago, and how she'd spent most of that visit on her phone. In the cockpit, Ethan Carter flew, and Atlanta Approach Control, which handled hundreds of aircraft a day and was thoroughly unmoved by almost all of them, had 2 controllers spontaneously comment to each other on the quality of the departure. Whoever that is, said one watching the radar, return track perfectly clean and perfectly on heading, that is a pilot. 14 minutes into the flight, Vanessa knocked on the cockpit door. She didn't wait for an answer. She opened it, leaned against the frame, and looked at the instrument panel with an expression Ethan couldn't quite categorize, something between curiosity and apology, though the apology was clearly still fighting for air. "You're leveled off," she said. "Flight level 380, yes." "It's smooth." "It should be." She was quiet for a moment. He could feel her looking at him rather than the instruments. "My executives think I've made a terrible mistake," she said. "They might be right." She almost smiled. Almost. "But you don't think so?" "No." "Why?" He considered the question. "Because we're at 38,000 feet, and everything's working, and we'll be on the ground in Savannah in 26 minutes. That's why." She looked at the hands on the yoke, his hands broad, steady, unhurried. "Dennis recognized your patch," she said. "I know. Edwards Air Force Base." He didn't say anything. "Test pilot." Still nothing. "How long?" she asked. The cockpit was quiet, except for the ambient hum of the engines and the quiet static of the radio. "Long enough," Ethan said finally. She waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. "Why are you fixing hydraulic lines at Atlanta International?" He was quiet for so long that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "My son needed breakfast made for him this morning, lunch packed in the right bag. He needed to be walked to the bus stop and told to have a good day by someone who meant it." He glanced at the altimeter. The hydraulic lines were just what came with the shift. Vanessa stood in the cockpit doorway for another moment. She looked at the side of his face, the gray at his temples, the line of his jaw, the way his eyes moved between instruments and horizon with the quiet efficiency of a man who has performed this particular act of attention for so long, it has become indistinguishable from breathing. "I laughed at you," she said. "Yes." "In front of my people." "Yes." That was, "Ma'am," he said quietly, "your father's waiting. Let's get you there." She stood in the doorway a moment longer. Then she went back to her seat, sat down, and folded her hands in her lap again. And this time, she left her phone in her bag. They were 12 minutes from Savannah when the weather hit. meant it didn't announce itself. That was the thing about serious weather over coastal Georgia in late spring. It didn't build politely from the horizon like a warning. It materialized. One moment the sky ahead was gray and flat and manageable. The next, the citation longitude punched through the edge of a convective cell that the morning forecast had placed 60 miles further east, and everything changed at once. The aircraft bucked hard. Not a gentle shimmy, a full, violent yaw to the left that snapped every head in the cabin sideways and sent a coffee cup shattering against the bulkhead. Someone screamed. Short, sharp. Cut off fast the way people cut off screams when they're embarrassed by their own fear. Ethan's hands were already moving. He hadn't waited for the turbulence to fully develop. He'd seen the pressure gradient shift on the weather radar 30 seconds earlier. A subtle change in the green to yellow boundary that most pilots would have noted and logged and maybe mentioned to passengers. Ethan had read it the way a combat veteran reads a doorway, with his whole body already deciding before his mind caught up. And then he pulled the power back 15%, dropped the nose 4 degrees, switched the autopilot off with his left thumb without looking at the panel, the way you'd scratch your own wrist, automatic total. "Savannah approach Whitmore 1, he said into the radio. His voice was the same voice he'd used to order coffee 40 minutes ago. Requesting immediate descent to flight level 240 and deviation 15 degrees south. We've got cells developing faster than forecast." The response came back in seconds. "Whitmore 1 deviation approved. Descend and maintain flight level 240. Be advised we're showing moderate to severe returns between your position and the field. How do you want to handle?" "I'll thread it," Ethan said. "Give me vectors when I'm through the layer." A pause on the frequency. Controllers didn't usually get pauses. Then, copy Whitmore 1. Vectors when through the layer. You want weather services on guard. Negative. I'll call you. In the back of the aircraft, Dennis Pryor had both hands braced against the armrests and was watching the cockpit door with an expression that had moved past worry into something closer to prayer. Hargrove beside him had gone the color of old wax. The two women from Vanessa's legal team were holding hands across the aisle, which neither of them would ever acknowledge afterward. And Vanessa Whitmore sat perfectly straight in her seat, her belt cinched tight, both feet flat on the floor, watching the cockpit door with the focused stillness of a woman who has survived enough boardroom crises to understand that watching the door was the only useful thing she could do right now. The aircraft shuddered again. Harder this time. The overhead panels rattled. Then the left engine fluctuated. Not a failure, not yet. A fluctuation. A subtle variation in N1 that showed up on the engine instrument display as a 5% swing that lasted 4 seconds and then normalized. Most pilots would have classified it as weather-related compressor turbulence. Would have logged it and moved on. So, Ethan felt it before he saw it. A change in the way the aircraft wanted to fly, a slight asymmetry in the push, like one arm suddenly less willing than the other. He cross-checked the engine parameters, fuel flow, oil pressure, ITT, everything nominal. The fluctuation was gone. He didn't trust it. "Savannah approach Whitmore 1. I want to declare a precautionary. Left engine showing intermittent fluctuation. Not an emergency. Precautionary." The frequency cleared immediately. 3 other aircraft that had been waiting to check in simply waited. When a pilot declared anything, the frequency belonged to them. Whitmore 1. "Savannah copies your precautionary. Emergency equipment will be standing by. Winds are 170 at 12 gusting 18. Runway 10 available. Do you want the ILS?" "Affirm. ILS runway 10. We'll manage our own speed." "Whitmore 1. ILS runway 10 is yours. Cleared for the approach." In the cabin, the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain. We have some rough weather between here and the field, and I've declared a routine precautionary that means emergency equipment will be visible when we land. It's standard procedure, and it doesn't mean anything is wrong. I need everyone seated belts tight, tray tables up. We're approximately 9 minutes from touchdown. Sit tight." For 3 seconds, nobody in the cabin said a word. Then Hargrove said, "Precautionary." "What the hell does that mean?" "It means exactly what he said," Dennis told him in a voice that left absolutely no room for follow-up questions. Hargrove didn't follow up. Vanessa stared at the cockpit door. 9 minutes, she thought. Her father was in a hospital 9 minutes away, and 9 minutes had never felt so long or so fragile in her life. She thought about Christmas. She thought about sitting across from him at the table and answering emails on her phone while he told a story about the neighborhood where he'd grown up, a story she'd heard 100 times and had never once listened to all the way through. She thought about the way he'd said goodbye at the airport afterward, a hug that lasted a half-second longer than usual, like he'd been trying to say something with his arms that he couldn't quite get his mouth around. She closed her eyes. In the cockpit, Ethan flew. The cell was worse through the middle than the edges had suggested. He'd known it would be. He'd flown through enough weather to understand that the radar painted a picture and the sky painted a different one, and the only way to know which was real was to be inside it, and by then the answer didn't matter as much as what you did next. The aircraft dropped hard through an air pocket 200 feet in less than a second, the kind of drop that leaves your stomach floating somewhere near your collarbone. He caught it with back pressure before the VSI could fully register the descent. Rolled the wings level. Checked the altimeter. Checked the radar. Checked the engine. Left engine was fluctuating again. Longer this time. 7 seconds. He pulled the throttle back slightly on the left side, let the right engine carry a hair more of the load. The asymmetry was manageable. The aircraft wanted to yaw left, and he corrected for it with right rudder, not mechanical, not muscled. Just a steady, even pressure that kept the ball centered and the nose pointed at where they needed to go. 7 minutes. 6. And he broke through the base of the cloud layer at 4,000 feet, and Savannah spread out below him, the river, the bridges, the low Georgia skyline, and the rain was coming down hard, and the visibility was marginal, but he could see the runway lights already aligned and steady, and something in his chest that had been pulled tight for the last 20 minutes let go 1 fraction of a degree. "Whitmore. 1 runway in sight," he said. "Whitmore 1 cleared to land. Wind 175 at 14 gusting to 22. Emergency equipment is in position." "Copy. Whitmore 1 is cleared to land." Men, he configured the aircraft. Gear down 3 green. Flaps to landing position. Speed stabilized at 130. The gust caught them twice on final, once pushing them right, once ballooning them slightly above the glide slope, and both times his corrections were so small and so immediate that they were barely visible on the flight instruments, just the smallest adjustment of hand and foot, the aircraft responding the way a well-trained animal responds to a rider it trusts. The mains touched at runway 10 at 7:53 in the morning. Smooth. He brought the thrust reversers up, let the aircraft slow, cleared the runway at the first turnoff. "Whitmore 1, clear of 10. Welcome to Savannah." He taxied in silence toward the private aviation ramp, where he could already see the flashing lights of the fire trucks and the ambulance that had scrambled on the precautionary call, and a small cluster of airport personnel who had come outside to see what was happening. He set the parking brake. He ran the shutdown checklist, 1 item at a time, no shortcuts. Then he sat in the left seat with both hands in his lap and looked at the instrument panel for exactly 4 seconds. He'd thought it would feel like more than this, or less. He hadn't known which. 6 years was a long time to stay away from something, and he'd imagined the return so many ways in the years right after, in the dark, at 2 in the morning, when Liam was asleep, and the apartment was quiet, and the wanting was so sharp it felt like grief, which he supposed it was. He hadn't imagined it feeling like this, like coming home to a house you'd deliberately left, like discovering that the key still fit. He opened the cockpit door. The cabin was silent for a moment after the engines shut down. Then it was loud all at once. Everyone moving, everyone talking, the sound of seatbelts coming undone, and bags coming down from the overhead, and people calling out to each other in the compressed language of relief. Ethan came through the cabin without ceremony, moving toward the door. He'd almost made it when Vanessa stepped directly into his path. She wasn't doing it deliberately. She was doing it the way you do things when you have too many feelings moving through you at once and your body acts before your manners do. She just stopped in the middle of the aisle and looked at him, and he stopped too because there was nowhere else to go. She'd been a CEO for 11 years. She'd sat across the table from men who were trying to take her company apart piece by piece, and she'd stared them down without blinking. She'd fired people she liked and made decisions that cost other people their jobs, and she'd done it all with the armor fully on and fully locked. The armor wasn't fully on right now. "You," she started. Stopped. Her jaw was working like she had a full sentence in there, but the first word was blocking the rest. That was, "We made it," Ethan said simply. "The engine will need to be looked at, but it held." She was looking at him the way you look at someone when you're trying to see past the thing you thought you knew and find the actual person underneath. It was uncomfortable. He'd been looked at that way before in different circumstances, and he'd never liked it. "Go," he said quietly. "Your father's waiting." She blinked. Whatever was building in her expression, gratitude, apology, something harder and more complicated got set aside because he was right, and she knew he was right, and there would be time for the rest of it later. She moved past him. At the door, she paused with one hand on the frame and turned back. Will you be here when I'll be here," he said. She looked at him one more second, then she was down the stairs and into the waiting car and gone. Dennis Pryor came to stand beside him in the now empty cabin. Outside the windows, the fire trucks were beginning to clear the ramp. The rain had lightened to a drizzle. "You going to tell me your call sign?" Dennis said. Ethan smiled, just slightly, the kind of smile that lived mostly in the corners. "No." "Edwards, 413th. You were testing X-planes." "Among other things." "That's the second time you've said that." "It's the second time you've asked." Dennis was quiet for a moment. "You know, I looked up some of what those guys flew. The kinds of conditions they certified aircraft in." He paused. "What you just did in there, threading that cell with a fluctuating engine on an ILS in marginal VMC. That's not what a ground tech does." "No," Ethan agreed. "It's not." "So what is it?" Ethan looked out the window at the Savannah skyline, the rain on the tarmac, the fire trucks rolling slowly back toward their station. "It's what I used to do," he said. Dennis nodded slowly. He understood the used to. Some men said it like a door that was closed. Some said it like a door they'd walked away from on purpose. Ethan said it like a man who had packed the room behind the door very carefully and locked it and put the key somewhere he could always find it, but had simply chosen not to. Until today. "You want to call anyone?" Dennis asked. "You've been out of contact." "Shao." "Yes." Ethan already had his phone out. There was one missed call from Carol and a text from Liam's school confirming he'd arrived. He typed a reply to Carol. "All good. Slight delay. Home by 6 instead of 4. Tell him I'll make his favorite for dinner." He pocketed the phone. "Mac and cheese," Dennis guessed. Ethan looked at him. "You got that expression," Dennis said. "The one where you're thinking about what to cook." "Spaghetti," Ethan said. "He's been on a spaghetti kick." Dennis laughed. It was an honest laugh, surprised out of him, and it cut through the tension in the cabin, the way a window opened in a stuffy room. They waited 2 hours at the Savannah private terminal. Ethan spent most of it in the pilot's lounge, a small room with a coffee maker and 2 couches and a television that was tuned to a local news channel. He drank 2 cups of coffee, better than Atlanta, he noted, and watched the weather radar update on the TV, and did not think about the engine fluctuation, or the cell, or the way the aircraft had wanted to go left on final. Except he did think about it. He thought about it the way you think about something you've been trained to analyze dispassionately, systematically, pulling the sequence apart and examining each decision to find the error he should have made differently. He didn't find one. That bothered him almost. It felt like luck, and he didn't trust luck. He'd trusted luck once over the Mojave Desert at 70,000 feet in an aircraft that cost more than most school districts, and the man flying off his left wing had trusted luck too. He pushed that away. He'd gotten better at pushing it. Not at making it disappear. It never fully disappeared, but at naming it and setting it aside the way you set a tool down when you're done with the job it's for. Grief was like that. You didn't lose it. You just learned when to put it down. Hargrove came into the pilot's lounge at 9:45, which Ethan had not expected. He came in without knocking, of course, and stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets and his jacket still immaculate like weather, and fear had simply slid off him without leaving a mark. "Hell of a flight," Hargrove said. Not warmly. Not coldly either. Just factually the way men sometimes manage honesty when they'd rather not but have no other option. "Yes," Ethan said. "That engine. We'll be fine. Compressor surge from the weather. It'll need an inspection, but there's no damage." Hargrove nodded. He stayed in the doorway. He hadn't come in to thank Ethan. Ethan could see that. He'd come in for something else. Probably he didn't quite know what. "I was one of the ones laughing," Hargrove said finally. Ethan looked at him. "I know. I didn't." He stopped. Tried again. "I've worked in aviation for 22 years. I know what good piloting looks like. I know exactly what you did up there." He paused. I still laughed. The room was quiet. "Why?" Ethan asked, not accusing. Genuinely curious the way you're curious about a mechanism you'd like to understand. Hargrove looked at his shoes, then back up. "Because you didn't look the part," he said. "And apparently that matters more to me than it should." It was the most honest thing Ethan had heard a stranger say in years. "I appreciate that," Ethan said. Hargrove nodded once, the decisive nod of a man who has completed a task he found unpleasant and can now move on. He turned to leave. "Mr. Hargrove." He stopped. "The laughter was fine," Ethan said. "People make assumptions. That's just human." He picked up his coffee cup. "It's what you do after you realize you were wrong that means something." Hargrove stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he left. Ethan drank his coffee. Vanessa came back at 11:23. She came through the door of the pilot's lounge, still in her charcoal blazer, still with her hair pulled back, but something about her was different, and it had nothing to do with appearance. She'd been crying. Not recently, her face was dry and composed, but recently enough that her eyes carried the specific softness that crying leaves behind when everything else has been cleaned up. She sat down in the chair across from him without being invited. She didn't ask if it was all right. He suspected she didn't ask people that very often. "He's stable," she said. "Good." "They're saying he has days, maybe a week." She looked at her hands. "Not months." Ethan didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. Months and days were different countries, and she'd just crossed the border, and sometimes the kindest thing was to let someone stand at the border a moment without filling the silence with words. "He was awake when I got there," she said. "He knew me." She paused. "He told me I looked tired." Something moved across Ethan's face that he didn't try to hide. "Sounds like a father." She looked up at him. "Did your wife?" She stopped herself. "I'm sorry, I don't—" "Cancer," he said. 3 years after Liam was born. Vanessa said nothing, which was the right thing, and he noted it. "She was the brave one," he said. "I was the one who flew experimental aircraft at Mach 2, and I was scared the whole time she was sick. She wasn't scared once. Not that she ever showed." He looked at the coffee cup in his hands. "I think that's what courage actually is. Not the absence of fear, just the decision to keep going anyway." Vanessa was very still. "What happened?" she said carefully. "To make you leave flying." He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer again. The same way he'd been quiet about Edwards, about the things he didn't carry in the open. Then he said, "I lost my wingman." 2 words that carried the weight of something she could feel from across the room. "Mojave Desert," he said. "Routine test profile. Nothing extraordinary." And then it was extraordinary. And by the time it was over, Marcus Webb was gone, and I was still there. And I have never once in the 6 years since been able to explain why it happened that way, and not the other way. The lounge was quiet. "His wife was 3 months pregnant," Ethan said. "His daughter is 5 now. I know because he was my best friend, and I check on them. I send something at Christmas, and on the birthday, and I never sign my name, because I don't know what I have a right to say." Vanessa looked at him for a long time. "That's why you left," she said. "That's part of it." He set the coffee cup down. "The other part was that Sarah died 8 months later. And then it was just me and Liam, and he needed someone to be present. Fully present. Not someone who was somewhere in the sky half the time thinking about all the ways things could go wrong. So you grounded yourself." "I chose him," Ethan said. "That's a different thing." She turned that over, looked at it from a few angles. Then she said something he hadn't expected. "Do you think he'd want you to stay grounded?" Ethan looked at her. "Liam," she said. "Do you think that's what he'd want if he understood what you gave up?" The question landed in the room and stayed there. Ethan didn't answer it. Not because he didn't have an answer. He had too many of them, and they were all fighting with each other and had been for 6 years. But because some questions weren't for answering in a pilot's lounge in Savannah at 11:23 in the morning. Some questions were for later in the dark when a 6-year-old boy who thought spaghetti was the height of culinary achievement was asleep in the next room. His phone buzzed. A text from Carol. "Liam wants to know if the spaghetti is the kind with the little meatballs or the big ones." He looked at the screen. He felt something shift in his chest, that specific, painful, irreplaceable weight of being needed by someone small in very specific and ordinary ways. He typed back big ones. Tell him big ones are obviously better. Vanessa watched him type. She didn't ask who it was. She knew. "Your flight back," she said. Can you fly us back this afternoon? The engine. We'll need a ground inspection first. I already called ahead to maintenance. If they clear it, yes." He looked up from the phone. "If they don't, we find another way home." She nodded. She was looking at him the way she'd looked at him on the aircraft that trying to see past the surface look, except this time she seemed closer to whatever was on the other side. "Why did you volunteer?" she said. "This morning. You didn't know me. You didn't owe me anything. She stopped. "I was not kind to you." Ethan considered the answer. "You needed help," he said finally. "And I could help. That's the whole thing." She stared at him. "That's the whole thing." "Yes. You're the most—" She shook her head, and for the first time all day something like a real smile appeared on her face. Not polished, not strategic, just real surprised out of her by the sheer simplicity of the man sitting across from her. "You are the most confounding human being I have encountered in 11 years of business." "I've been called worse," Ethan said. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sky over Savannah was pale and washed and wide open. The way skies get after weather moves through, like the air itself, had been cleaned and hung out to dry. Ethan looked at it through the lounge window, without meaning to. Just the automatic glance of someone who has been reading weather his whole adult life. Good visibility now, ceiling lifting. The afternoon flight back would be smooth. He knew it the same way he'd known the cell would be worse than the radar showed. His body remembered. It had always remembered. He'd just been very careful not to let it speak. The maintenance team called at 12:41. Left engine inspected. Compressor blades intact. Seals nominal. The fluctuation had been exactly what he'd told Hargrove: weather-induced surge, no lasting damage. Aircraft was cleared to fly. Ethan Carter looked at the cleared-to-fly report in his hand. He looked at the window. He looked at the phone in his other hand, the last message from Liam visible on the screen. "Big ones, Dad, obviously." He put both things in his pocket. He stood up. He walked back out toward the aircraft. And somewhere above the cleared Georgia sky at 38,000 feet, and climbing a radio operator at Atlanta Center, who'd been working traffic for 19 years, would later tell his wife over dinner that he'd tracked a return that afternoon that moved through the airspace the way he imagined a hawk moved through open air. Not fighting it, not afraid of it, just completely and entirely at home. He didn't know who was flying it, but he knew it was someone who'd been away for a while and had just come back. The flight back to Atlanta left Savannah at 1:47 in the afternoon. Ethan had the aircraft climbing through 10,000 feet before anyone in the cabin had finished settling in, the way a man moves when he's no longer deciding whether to do something and has simply begun doing it. The hesitation that had lived in his hands for 6 years, that slight pause before committing the fraction of a second, where muscle memory fought against the decision to stay grounded, it was gone. Not because the day had been easy, because it hadn't. And he'd done it anyway. The sky was clear all the way back. No weather, no drama, no compressor fluctuation. Just altitude and airspeed and the quiet professional music of a well-maintained aircraft doing exactly what it was built to do. Ethan flew it with the same unhurried precision he'd shown that morning, but something was different now, and Dennis Pryor, sitting in the first row of the cabin, noticed it immediately. He'd been watching pilots his entire career. He knew the difference between a man who was performing and a man who was simply being what he was. Ethan Carter, at 1:52 in the afternoon, 38,000 feet over central Georgia, was simply being what he was. Dennis picked up his phone and sent a text to a number he hadn't used in almost 3 years. The message was 4 words. "I think I found him." He didn't expect a reply before they landed. He got one in 40 seconds. "Where?" Dennis looked at the cockpit door. "Atlanta, Hartsfield-Jackson. He's been hiding in ground ops." And the reply took longer this time. 11 seconds. "Are you sure it's him?" Dennis looked at the cockpit door again. He thought about the way Ethan had threaded that convective cell with a fluctuating engine and marginal visibility, and done it like a man threading a needle he'd threaded 10,000 times before. "I'm sure," he typed. He put the phone in his pocket and didn't touch it for the rest of the flight. They landed at Atlanta at 2:49. Ethan taxied to the Whitmore private terminal, ran the shutdown sequence, and had the door open by 2:53. He came down the boarding stairs with his jacket over his arm and his maintenance badge still clipped to his chest, same as he'd looked 7 hours ago when the day had started, except that 7 hours ago the badge had been the whole story, and now it was just the cover. He shook Dennis Pryor's hand at the bottom of the stairs. Firm brief, the handshake of men who understand each other without requiring a ceremony about it. He nodded to Hargrove, who nodded back with the careful respect of someone who'd spent 3 hours reconsidering something. And then Vanessa was there. She'd stopped at the base of the stairs with her phone in her hand, and her bag over her shoulder, ready to be driven wherever she needed to be driven next, because that was how her life worked. There was always somewhere to be driven next. But she'd stopped. She was looking at him, and she had the expression of someone who has prepared a speech and has suddenly decided the speech is wrong. "I owe you an apology," she said. "You don't," Ethan said. "I do, and I'm not someone who says that lightly." She looked at him steadily. "I mocked you in front of my entire team, in front of airport staff. I laughed at you." "I know. And you flew us anyway." "Yes." "Why?" She said, "Do you keep saying yes like that, like one syllable is enough?" "Because it is," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, then she said something she clearly hadn't planned to say. "I'd like to talk to you again. Not about today. About..." She paused, searching. "About what comes next." Ethan looked at her carefully. What comes next for me is spaghetti and a 6-year-old who thinks he has opinions about meatball size. Something crossed her face that was close to a laugh, but didn't quite make it. I meant professionally. I know what you meant. And he looked at the aircraft, at the badge on his chest, at the sky above the terminal, which was clear and pale and wide and patient, the way skies are in the late afternoon when the heat has gone out of the day. Call Dennis, he said. If you have something to say it to Dennis first. He'll know if it's worth saying to me. He put his jacket on. He picked up the small bag he'd grabbed from his locker before the morning's insanity had begun, the one with his lunch that he'd never eaten. He walked to the access gate, badged through, and went back to the place where he'd started the day. He was back at gate C7 at 3:15. His afternoon supervisor, a man named Roy, with 22 years in ground ops and the conversational style of someone who believed information should be rationed, looked up from his clipboard when Ethan came in and said, "You were at the Whitmore terminal this morning." "Yes," Ethan said. "You flew their jet," Roy said. "Yes." Roy looked at him for a moment. "Huh," he said. Then he went back to his clipboard. That was Roy's entire response to one of the more extraordinary mornings in the history of their department, and Ethan found it deeply satisfying. He spent the rest of the afternoon doing what he always did. He checked hydraulic lines. He logged reports. He filed the maintenance inspection paperwork on a 737 that had come in with a suspect brake assembly on the left main gear. He ate the sandwich from his bag at 4 o'clock, sitting on the equipment cart near C9, watching the afternoon traffic cycle through the gates with the particular rhythm of a major hub that never really pauses, just breathes. At 4:37, his phone buzzed. Not Carol, not Liam's school. A number he didn't recognize. Georgia area code. He almost didn't answer. He wasn't someone who answered unknown numbers, but something the specific timing of it, the way it came in exactly as he was thinking about what Vanessa had said, what comes next, made him pick up. "Ethan Carter," he said. Silence for 2 seconds. Then a voice he hadn't heard in 6 years. "Carter, it's Brigadier General James Whitfield. Don't hang up." Ethan stood up from the equipment cart. He walked away from the gate, away from the noise of the ramp, until he found a relatively quiet section of the terminal corridor where he could hear clearly. His heart was doing something he didn't have a name for. Not fast, not slow. Just differently measured, like it had shifted gears without announcing the intention. "General," he said. "I'm not calling officially," Whitfield said. "I want that on the record before we say another word. This is a personal call. I'm calling because Dennis Pryor texted a friend of mine 3 hours ago, and that friend called me." Ethan leaned against the corridor wall. Small world. It is when you're good enough that people remember you. A pause. "I heard what you did this morning. Full account. The weather, the engine, the approach. I heard all of it. It was a routine flight with complications," Ethan said. "Any current ATP would have handled it." "Carter." "Sir, don't do that," Whitfield said. "Don't minimize. You and I both know there were 7 ATP-rated pilots in Atlanta this morning who were available for charter, and not one of them took that flight. You know why? Because the weather package scared them off. 3 of them declined before you even volunteered." He paused again. "You threaded a convective cell in marginal conditions with a fluctuating engine at 8 nautical miles. Don't call that routine." Ethan said nothing. "I've been looking for you for 4 years, Whitfield said. "I wasn't lost." "I know. That's what made it hard." His voice shifted slightly, became less military, more human. "How's the boy?" Ethan blinked. Of all the directions he'd expected the conversation to go, that one had come from somewhere outside his peripheral vision entirely. "He's 6, Ethan said. He stopped. What was Liam? He was fierce and funny, and he drew rocket ships on napkins, and he had complicated feelings about meatball size, and he was the reason Ethan got up at 5:30 every single morning without once needing an alarm. "He's good," he said. "He's really good." "Good." Whitfield was quiet for a moment. I'm not asking you to come back to any program. I want to be clear about that. That's not this call. Then what is this call? This call is me telling you that what happened this morning is going to travel, Whitfield said simply. Atlanta. ATC logs those approaches. The audio from your radio calls with Savannah approach is already being passed around. People are already asking who Whitmore 1 was. It's been less than 8 hours, and I already know your name is going to be in 3 different conversations by tomorrow morning that you didn't authorize and can't control. Ethan closed his eyes. I wanted you to hear it from me first, Whitfield said, so you could decide how you want to handle it before it decides for you. The corridor was loud around him. Rolling luggage gate announcements, the layered white noise of an airport that processed hundreds of thousands of people every week and cared about none of them individually. Ethan stood in the middle of it and felt for the first time all day something that wasn't competence or grief or love or duty. He felt afraid, not of flying. He'd rediscovered today with total clarity that flying didn't frighten him. What frightened him was the other thing, the thing that came with being seen. General, he said carefully, I have a 6-year-old boy who lost his mother when he was 3. He has one parent. One. If I become something that gets talked about and written about and remembered in the wrong way for the wrong reasons, that's not what I'm describing. What are you describing? I'm describing the possibility, Whitfield said slowly, that you don't have to choose between your son and the sky. That maybe hiding was protecting you both when you needed it, and maybe it doesn't need to protect you anymore. He paused. That's all I'm describing. What you do with it is yours. Ethan opened his eyes. Gate C7 was visible from where he was standing. His normal. His quiet, invisible, chosen normal. I'll think about it, he said. That's all I'm asking. Whitfield's voice returned to its standard register, crisp, measured the voice of a man who'd commanded things for 20 years and knew when a conversation was complete. For what it's worth, Carter, Marcus would have wanted you to fly. The words hit him in the sternum like something physical. He didn't answer. He didn't trust his voice enough to answer. I'll be in Atlanta next Thursday, Whitfield said. If you want to get coffee, I'll be at the Marriott near the airport. No agenda, no uniform, just coffee. The call ended. Ethan stood in the corridor for 45 seconds without moving. Just standing. Just breathing. Just being a man in a maintenance uniform in the middle of an airport who had just had the quietest possible version of the ground shift under his feet. Then he walked back to Gate C7 and finished his shift. Bye. He was home by 6:15. Carol met him at the door with the specific expression of a woman who has seen things on the news and has questions, but is too good a neighbor to lead with them. She was 63 years old, short with silver hair, and the steady warmth of someone who has been reliably kind for so long, it had become indistinguishable from character. There's something on the local news, she said carefully. About a flight out of Whitmore this morning. Something about a ground tech who... I'll talk to Liam first, Ethan said. She stepped aside. She understood the order of operations. Liam was in the living room with a crayon drawing spread across the coffee table, tongue slightly out the way it always was when he was concentrating. 6 years old, and built like his mother. Dark eyes, quick hands, a quality of attention that focused and released like a camera lens. He looked up when Ethan came in, and his face did the thing it always did. The thing that Ethan could never have prepared himself for when he'd become a parent, and had never once gotten used to it, simply lit up. Not performed, not conscious. Just lit up the way a room changes when someone walks in who matters. Dad. Hey, buddy? Liam launched himself off the couch with the uncomplicated physics of a child who has never once doubted whether he'd be caught. Ethan caught him. He held him for a moment longer than usual, and Liam, who was perceptive in the way children are, when they've only had one parent to pay attention to, went still for just a second, and then said, "You okay?" "I'm great," Ethan said. You have a good day." Mrs. Patterson said the word awkward in class, and everybody laughed except Jalen. And Jalen is so weird. Liam reported this with the grave authority of a witness. "Also the meatballs. Are we having the big ones?" "Big ones," Ethan confirmed. He set him down. Liam went back to his drawing, apparently satisfied. Ethan stood in the middle of his living room, his small, specific, carefully built living room with the framed photograph of Sarah on the bookshelf, and the crayon drawings on the refrigerator, and Liam's shoes kicked sideways near the door, and felt the collision of his two worlds happening somewhere in the center of his chest. He made spaghetti. He made it the way Sarah used to make it because she'd spent 2 months teaching him after the diagnosis, and she'd been very specific about the garlic and the amount of time the sauce needed, and he'd written it all down in a notebook, that he still had her handwriting in the margins, correcting his, and he had never once deviated from the recipe because deviation felt like losing something else. He and Liam ate at the kitchen table. Liam told him about the lunch situation at school, not the allergy table drama that had resolved, but a new ongoing situation involving someone named Cooper, and the question of who had the better sneakers. Ethan listened with his full attention the way he always did, because Liam's world was real and immediate and mattered, and parenting at the table was one of the things Sarah had been clear about. "Be here," she'd said. "Not almost here. Actually, here." Manubo. He was here. After dinner, after Liam had been through the homework and the bath, and the argument about whether superheroes needed to sleep, they did. Ethan maintained they absolutely did. He sat on the edge of Liam's bed in the dim light with the specific tired satisfaction of a man who has done an impossible day and landed safely on the other side. "Dad," Liam said. He was in that half-in half-out state of pre-sleep voice, loose and soft. "Did you really fly a plane today?" Ethan looked at him. "Where'd you hear that?" "Carol told me. She said it was on the news." He opened his eyes all the way, suddenly more awake. "Did you?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Yes." Liam processed this with the serious deliberation he brought to important things. "Like a real plane? Not like the little ones at the air show." "A real plane. A jet." Liam's eyes got wide. "Was it cool?" Ethan thought about the moment the mains touched on runway 10 in Savannah. The way the aircraft had settled onto the ground, smooth and clean and exactly right after everything it had come through. He thought about the way Atlanta approach had gone quiet on the frequency when he'd called in the precautionary, giving him the whole sky. "Yeah," he said. "It was cool." Liam thought about this. Then, in the drifting voice of someone almost asleep, "You should do it more." Ethan sat in the dim room, with his son's breathing going slow and even, and the night settling around the house, and Whitfield's words moving through him like something that had been waiting a long time for the right temperature to dissolve. "Marcus would have wanted you to fly." He didn't know if that was true. He thought about Marcus every day, had thought about him every single day for 6 years, and he didn't know. Marcus had been competitive and brilliant and loud in the way only fighter pilots could be loud, and he'd had opinions about everything, including coffee temperature and approach angles and the correct way to describe a crosswind, and Ethan had argued with him about all of it and loved every argument. He did not know what Marcus would have wanted, but he knew what Marcus would have said. They were different things. What Marcus would have said because he was Marcus, because he was incapable of letting anything stand without commentary. Was this Carter? "You are the only man I know who can land a crippled aircraft in a crosswind and then spend the next 6 years convinced he did something wrong by surviving it." He'd said something close to it once, actually. Years before the Mojave, after a different bad day. Ethan sat in Liam's room for a long time after the boy was fully asleep. Then he went to the kitchen table and opened his laptop. The Whitmore aviation story had made local news in Atlanta by 8 o'clock. Not front page, not breaking news, just a 20-second segment on the local affiliate about a private jet that had declared a precautionary inbound to Savannah in difficult weather conditions and landed safely. The anchor mentioned that the aircraft had been flown by a ground technician after the scheduled pilot experienced a medical emergency. She said it with the mild surprise of someone reading an interesting footnote. By 9:15, it had been picked up by an aviation industry newsletter with 12,000 subscribers headlined, "ATP-rated ground tech saves Whitmore flight in severe weather, who is he?" By 10, the comment section had 47 responses. Ethan didn't read them. He read the headline, closed the tab, and sat at the kitchen table with the laptop in front of him and his hands flat on the table on either side of it. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he did recognize this time. Dennis Pryor, Ethan. I need to tell you something. I didn't tell you this morning because I wanted to wait until you were on the ground. Whitmore Aviation has been in trouble. Financial restructuring for 14 months. Vanessa's been keeping it quiet. The company needs something. Something people can believe in. A pause. Then a second message. She's going to call you. Whatever she offers, don't say no before you hear all of it. Ethan stared at the messages. Chai. He typed back. How long have you known about the company? Dennis long enough to know today wasn't just about getting her to Savannah. Ethan set the phone down. Ethan set. He stood up. He walked to the window. Outside, the Atlanta night was doing what Atlanta nights did. Warm, thick, the sound of a city that didn't fully sleep. He could see the distant flash of a landing light, high up some commercial flight, making its approach into Hartsfield from the east. And he tracked it the way he always tracked aircraft, even when he was trying not to. The automatic calculation of its flight path and descent angle running in the background of his mind like a program that never fully closed. His phone rang. Not a text, a call. At 10:22 at night. Vanessa Whitmore. He looked at the screen for 2 full rings. Then he answered. I know it's late, she said before he could speak. It's all right. I need to... She stopped. He heard her exhale. Not the controlled exhale of a CEO managing optics. The real kind. I need to tell you something, and I need to tell it honestly, which is not something I'm always good at in professional conversations. All right, he said again. Whitmore Aviation is in trouble, she said. I've been in restructuring for over a year. We've lost 2 major contracts. Our insurance rates went up after an incident that wasn't our fault, but still went through our operation. My board is 2 bad quarters away from voting to sell. She paused. Today, what you did today, it's already moving through the industry. I've had 3 phone calls since we landed. People who've been watching to see if we're still worth betting on. Ethan was very still. What kind of calls? The kind where people use the word confidence, she said. One of them specifically said, and I'm quoting, any operation that produces a flight like that one in those conditions is an operation I'm willing to talk to. The kitchen was quiet around him. Vanessa, he said carefully. I'm not a symbol. I'm a person. I know that. And I have a son who needs his father to be present and consistent and not flying into convective cells every Tuesday. I know that too. Her voice was different than it had been that morning. Less armored, less certain in the way powerful people are, certain when they still believe the armor is enough. I'm not asking you to be a symbol. I'm asking you to consider coming to work for us. Properly. Head of flight operations. You'd have authority over every aircraft in our fleet, every pilot, every procedure. You'd set the culture. A pause. And you'd fly when you wanted to fly, not when you had to. Ethan sat down at this kitchen table again. His hands were flat on either side of the laptop. He looked at the screen, which still had the aviation newsletter tab open. Who is he? The headline read. He thought about the key in his pocket. The one he'd been carrying for 6 years without using it. I need to think, he said. I know. And I need to talk to my son. A beat. He's 6, yes, and the decisions I make affect him, which means he gets a vote. He paused. That might sound strange to you. It doesn't, she said quietly. It sounds like good parenting. Ethan looked at the photograph of Sarah on the bookshelf. Taken on a Tuesday afternoon for no reason, which was why he loved it. Not a holiday, not an occasion, just her in the kitchen laughing at something he'd said caught by accident in the exact right moment. "Be here," she'd said. "Actually here." Mates. He was here. He was always here. But the question that had lived unasked in his chest all day was whether here could be bigger than it had been. Whether being here for Liam meant only this kitchen, this badge, this careful invisibility. Or whether it could mean something that Liam would one day understand. "I'll call you Thursday," he said. "Thursday," she agreed. "And Vanessa." "Yes. Don't make this about the company when you tell people about today," he said. It wasn't about the company. It was about a woman who needed to get to her father in time. He paused. That's the story worth telling. The silence on the other end was long enough that he wondered if she was still there. Then she said very quietly, "He held my hand for 2 hours this afternoon. Just held it. Didn't say much. Just held it." Ethan closed his eyes. "Good," he said. "That's good." He put the phone down. Outside, another landing light swept past the window, close enough that the sound reached him 2 seconds later. The low diminishing thunder of turbofans on short final, a sound that lived in his bones like a second heartbeat. He sat with it. He sat with all of it. Marcus and Sarah and Liam and Whitfield, and the key and the sky and the smooth landing feeling at runway 10, and the way his hands had known exactly what to do before his mind had caught up. He sat with it until the night was fully quiet. And then he went to bed. And for the first time in 6 years, he dreamed about flying. Not the nightmare version, not the Mojave, not the silence on the radio after Marcus went down, not the terrible geometry of a crippled aircraft and a man who didn't make it. The other version. The one he'd buried so deep he'd almost stopped believing it existed. Just sky. Just speed. Just the specific joy of a thing done exactly right. He woke up at 5:29, 1 minute before the alarm. He lay in the dark and listened to his son breathing through the wall. Then he got up. He made coffee. He made Liam's lunch. Blue bag. Big meatballs left over from last night in a small container that Carol had shown him how to pack so they wouldn't get cold. He clipped his badge to his chest. He stood at the kitchen window with his coffee and watched the first planes of the morning begin their approaches into Hartsfield, the landing lights sweeping the dark sky in long, slow arcs, patient and precise, each one carrying something or someone somewhere that mattered to somebody. He watched them for a long time. Then he pulled out his phone and scrolled to Thursday in his calendar. He typed coffee, Marriott, Whitfield. He set the phone down. He drank his coffee. He waited for his son to wake up. Thursday came, the way important days always come quietly, without announcement, looking exactly like any other morning until you were already inside it. Ethan was up at 5:29 again, same as every day. He made Liam's lunch first, then his own coffee, then stood at the kitchen window, doing what he'd been doing every morning since Monday, watching the landing lights sweep the dark Atlanta sky and asking himself the same question he hadn't yet answered. He had 4 days to think about Vanessa's offer. He'd spent all 4 of them thinking about everything except the offer itself, which was its own kind of answer if he'd been willing to look at it directly. Instead, he'd thought about Marcus, about Sarah, about the way Liam had said you should do it more with the casual certainty of a child who hasn't yet learned to be afraid of the things he wants. He'd thought about that most of all. At 7:45, he dropped Liam at the bus stop. Liam was wearing his good sneakers, the ones that apparently settled the ongoing Cooper dispute conclusively, and he had his blue bag and his homework folder and the expression of a child with important business to conduct. "Dad," Liam said at the bus stop, not looking up from his sneakers. "Yeah." "Are you going to fly planes again?" Ethan looked at him. What makes you ask that? Liam shrugged with the elaborate casualness of a 6-year-old who has been thinking about something for days and is pretending he just thought of it. Carol said people are talking about you, and you've been looking at the sky a lot. He finally looked up, more than usual. Ethan crouched down to his level. It was something Sarah had taught him. Get down to his height, look him in the eye, treat what he says like it matters, because it does. How would you feel if I did? Liam considered this with genuine seriousness. Would you still make spaghetti? Every week. Would you still walk me to the bus? Every morning. Another pause. The bus was 2 blocks away, the sound of it arriving at the edges of their conversation. Would you be happy? Liam asked. The question was so simple and so precisely aimed that it went straight through all the armor Ethan had spent 6 years building and landed somewhere undefended. Yeah, buddy, he said. I think I would. Liam nodded. Decisive. The matter was apparently settled to his satisfaction. Okay then. He picked up his bag. The bus wheezed to a stop. He climbed the steps, then turned back. Tell the lady with the fancy planes I said hi. Ethan stood up. You don't know her name. She's the one who laughed at you, right? He blinked. Carol told you that too. Carol tells me everything. He disappeared into the bus. Ethan stood at the bus stop for a moment after it pulled away. Then he did something he almost never did at 7:48 in the morning. He laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a managed one. A real one surprised out of him by a 6-year-old in good sneakers who had just cut through 4 days of agonizing with 2 questions and a bus to catch. He was still smiling when he walked into the Marriott lobby at 8:55. Whitfield was already there. He was at a corner table, civilian clothes, a plain dark jacket, and no insignia of any kind. But he sat the way men sit, when command has been their natural posture for 20 years, straight-backed, without looking rigid, present in a room without requiring the room to acknowledge him. He had a coffee in front of him, and he stood when Ethan walked in, which was a thing Ethan hadn't expected, and which mattered more than he would have known how to explain. They shook hands, sat down. You look the same, Whitfield said. I don't, Ethan said. No, Whitfield agreed. I meant you carry yourself the same. He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. I heard you flew back to Atlanta Monday afternoon too. Smooth flight, ATC says. Weather had cleared. And the morning flight, managed. Whitfield looked at him steadily. Dennis said you threaded a convective cell with a fluctuating left engine at 8 nautical miles in marginal conditions and landed a precautionary on runway 10 without breaking a sweat. Dennis exaggerates. Dennis is former Air Force. He doesn't exaggerate. Whitfield set his mug down. Carter, you want to just talk to me, not like a briefing, not like a debrief, just 2 people having coffee who've known each other a long time. Ethan was quiet for the moment. Then, all right. Are you okay? The question was so direct and so genuine that it took him a full 3 seconds to process it. Not how are you, not the social reflex of it, but the actual inquiry. Are you okay? From a man who knew enough of the story to understand why the answer might not be simple. Most days, Ethan said. And Monday. And Monday. He thought about it honestly. Monday I was more okay than I'd been in a while, which was its own kind of complicated. Whitfield nodded slowly. He understood complicated. The guilt, he said. Not a question. The guilt, Ethan confirmed. You spend long enough telling yourself you don't deserve the thing you love, and then the one day you do it again, and everything works. It doesn't feel like relief. It feels like a problem. Because feeling good feels like a betrayal. Yes. Whitfield was quiet for a moment. You know what I remember about Marcus Webb? Ethan looked at him. He used to say that the most dangerous pilot in any squadron was the one who stopped believing he deserved to be there, because doubt doesn't kill you clean. It kills you in the margins. The half-second hesitation. The commitment that comes a beat too late. He picked up his mug. You had no hesitation Monday. None. I've talked to Savannah Approach. I've listened to the audio. There is not one moment in that flight where I hear a man who thinks he doesn't belong in that cockpit. Ethan stared at the table. Marcus would be furious with you, Whitfield said. For the record. I know. He'd also be proud. He said it flatly, the way you say true things when sentiment would cheapen them. Both. At the same time. That was Marcus. Ethan picked up his coffee. His hands were steady. What is this conversation actually about, General? Whitfield met his eyes. I had a call Tuesday morning from the FAA's Civil Aviation Safety Division. They've been developing a new advanced weather operations training program for commercial pilots. High-altitude convective cell navigation. They need a lead instructor with practical experience in both military test conditions and civilian IFR procedures. He paused. Someone who's actually threaded weather that would make a classroom scenario look mild. Ethan set his cup down. It's not full-time flight ops, Whitfield continued. It's curriculum development and instruction, Atlanta-based. You'd be home every night. And when you do fly for demonstration purposes, you choose the conditions and you set the parameters. He looked at him steadily. No one sends you into anything you don't control. The lobby of the Marriott continued around them. Business people rolling suitcases, the ambient sound of a city in motion. Ethan sat at the corner table and felt the weight of what was being offered settle on him like something he'd been carrying for a long time, without knowing what shape it was. You've been building toward this call for 4 days, Ethan said. I've been building toward this call for 4 years, Whitfield said. Monday just told me you were ready to hear it. A long silence. I've also had a conversation with Vanessa Whitmore, Whitfield said. Ethan looked at him sharply. She called me Wednesday, Whitfield said, holding up one hand. I didn't call her. She found me, which frankly is impressive on its own. She wanted to know if I thought you were serious about coming back, or if Monday was an anomaly. He paused. I told her it wasn't an anomaly. I told her the only question was whether Ethan Carter was ready to stop protecting himself from his own life. The words landed like something physical. She said. Whitfield almost smiled. That sounded like something she needed to work on herself. Ethan looked at the table, at his hands, at the coffee ring left by the mug on the white surface. What exactly did she offer you to make that call? Nothing, Whitfield said. She didn't need to. She told me about the flight. She told me what you said at the bottom of the stairs about choosing Liam. And she said... He paused. She said she'd laughed at a man who was better than everyone in the room, and that she wanted to make it right, and she wasn't asking permission. She just wanted to know if he was the kind of man who let people make things right. Ethan was very still. Are you? Whitfield asked. Outside the lobby windows, an airport shuttle moved through the drop-off lane. Ethan tracked it without thinking. He did that. He always did that. I need to make a call, he said. Whitfield leaned back. Take your time. He stepped outside. The morning was already warm, the specific humid warmth of Atlanta in late spring that gets into your collar and stays there. He stood on the sidewalk outside the Marriott entrance and called a number he hadn't dialed in 3 years. It rang 4 times. He almost hung up. Hello. A woman's voice. Young, tired in the way of a person who is always a little tired. Claire, he said. It's Ethan Carter. A pause. 2 seconds. 3. Long enough that he felt the familiar spike of wondering if he should have called if this was wrong, if he was using someone else's grief to justify his own decisions. Ethan. Her voice was careful but not cold. I saw your name this morning, in the news. I know. I'm sorry about that. Don't be. He heard her shift the sound of a chair of movement. Maya asked about you last week. His throat tightened. She did? She's been asking about her dad's friends. She's at the age where she wants to know who he was. the whole picture. A pause. I told her there was a man who was his best friend, who checked on us every year, who never signed his name. Ethan closed his eyes. She asked me why he didn't sign his name, Claire said. He couldn't speak for a moment. I didn't know what to tell her. Claire continued, and her voice was gentle, the specific gentleness of someone who has done a great deal of processing and has arrived somewhere on the other side of pure grief. I think maybe you didn't know either. No, he said. I didn't. Ethan. She waited until he was clearly listening. Marcus talked about you constantly. He would have wanted... Her voice caught slightly, then steadied. He was not a man who believed in stopping. In anything. You know that. I know. And you stopped, she said. Not accusing, just observing. You stopped for Liam, which I understand. But I don't think Marcus would have seen those as an either-or. The shuttle came back around the drop-off lane. Ethan tracked it again. I want to sign my name, he said. Going forward, if that's all right. A silence. Then, Maya would like that. Another pause. So would I. And he stayed on the call another 10 minutes. They talked about Maya. She liked dinosaurs and hated math and had her father's laugh, Claire said, which she'd discovered from a video. They talked about the Christmas checks which Claire had been putting into a college fund for 3 years and hadn't known how to tell him. They talked around the harder things, the ones that would take more than one phone call, but the path toward those things was now open, and they both knew it. Danny. When he hung up, he stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the phone in his hand and felt something shift in him that had been locked for 6 years. Not gone, it would never be gone, but unlocked. The difference between a wound sealed and a wound healed. He hadn't known until right now how much of the weight he'd been carrying was the silence. He went back inside. Whitfield looked at him and asked nothing. Tell me about the FAA program, Ethan said. They talked for 90 minutes. By the time Ethan walked out of the Marriott at 10:45, he had said neither yes nor no to anything, but he had asked enough questions that both of them knew where the conversation was heading. He knew the timeline, he knew the structure. He knew that the program would require him to be certified current in 3 additional aircraft types, which meant structured training flights, which meant being back in a cockpit, not as an emergency, but as a matter of course, which meant his son's father was going to be a pilot again. He sat in his truck in the parking lot for 4 minutes. Then he called Vanessa Whitmore. She picked up on the second ring. I was wondering when you'd call. It's not even 11 in the morning. I've been up since 5. Me too, he said. You called Whitfield. I did. You could have called me, Ev. I could have, she agreed. But I thought he might be able to say things to you that I couldn't, given the history. A pause. Was I wrong? He thought about Marcus would have wanted you to fly, about the way Whitfield had said it flat, factual, no sentiment, which was the only way it could have landed right. No, he said. You weren't wrong. So. He could hear her sitting forward. Are you going to tell me I need to call Dennis? Despite himself, despite everything, he smiled. No, this one I'll say to you directly. I'm listening. I'm not taking the head of flight operations position, he said. Not right now. I have something I need to build first with the FAA program, and it needs my full attention for at least a year. He paused. But I'd like to consult with your operation. I'll look at your safety procedures, your pilot training protocols, your weather decision-making framework. If there are gaps, I'll tell you. If there are strengths, I'll tell you that too. She was quiet for a moment. That's not what I offered. No, it's what I'm able to give right now. He paused. When the program is established, and I know what the schedule looks like, we can talk again. About more. Another silence. He waited. All right, she said. Consulting. Then, For what it's worth, Carter, when I offered you the position, I wasn't thinking about what the company needed. I was thinking about what I'd seen on that flight and wanting more of it. A pause, and her voice shifted into something more direct. I was also thinking that you'd spent 6 years undervalued, and that didn't sit right with me, regardless of what it meant for Whitmore. He didn't know what to do with that exactly, so he did what he usually did with things he didn't know how to answer. He let them be true and moved on. I'll have Dennis set up a time next week, he said. Next week. He could hear the smile. You're very methodical. I have a 6-year-old, he said. Everything runs on a schedule or nothing runs at all. She laughed. Actually laughed the real version, the one that had been ambushed out of her by something she hadn't expected. Tell him I said hello. He already told me to tell you hi. A beat. He doesn't know me. No, but he knows you're the one who laughed, and apparently he thinks that's resolved. She was quiet for a moment. Kids are extraordinary, she said softly. Yes, Ethan agreed. They really are. He was back at Hartsfield by noon. Bims. Not gate C7. He had the afternoon off, had taken it deliberately, because he'd known Thursday would take something out of him regardless of how it went. He went to the Whitmore private terminal instead through the access gate because Dennis had called him at 11 and asked if he could stop by. When Dennis was waiting for him near the citation longitude, which was back in its slot, and apparently fully serviced and cleared after the engine inspection. He had 2 coffees from the terminal cafe, the decent kind, not the break room kind, and he held one out when Ethan approached. How'd it go? Dennis said. I talked to Claire Webb this morning, Ethan said. Dennis went very still. Marcus's wife. Yes. How is she? Good. Maya's 5 and apparently has Marcus's laugh. He took the coffee. Claire said she's been putting the Christmas checks into a college fund. Dennis looked at the aircraft. His jaw was working slightly. That's... He stopped, started over. That's good, Ethan. Yeah. He looked at the jet, too. I'm going to sign my name from now on. They stood there for a moment, 2 men looking at an airplane and not talking about the airplane at all. The FAA program, Dennis said eventually. Whitfield told you. He did? You'd be good at it. Teaching? Dennis looked at him. You have the thing you can't teach, you know what it feels like when it goes wrong, and you come through anyway. That's what young pilots need to understand. Not the textbook version, the real version. Ethan drank his coffee. You're going to tell me what I should be doing with my career now? Yes, Dennis said without any apology about it. Because you spent 6 years telling yourself what you shouldn't be doing, and I'm trying to balance the ledger. Ethan looked at him. Dennis looked back. This was, Ethan realized, the most direct conversation he'd had with a colleague in 6 years, which probably said something about what he'd allowed his life to become. Dennis, he said, why did you text Whitfield on Monday? You barely know him. Dennis wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He was quiet for a moment that had weight to it. Because 15 years ago, before I went into aviation management, I was flying corporate jets, and I had a bad year, medically. Came close to losing my certificate, came close to losing a lot more than that. He paused. Someone found me when I was hiding. Didn't make a big deal of it. Just opened a door and let me find my own way through. He looked at Ethan. You do that for people when you recognize the hiding. That's all. Ethan said nothing for a moment. Who was it? He asked. The one who opened the door for you. Dennis smiled slightly. Brigadier General James Whitfield, he said. 32 years ago at Edwards Air Force Base. He was a lieutenant colonel then. I was a young Air Force pilot who'd lost his nerve after a bad ejection, and he took me out to the flight line one morning and told me I could stand there as long as I needed to, and no one was going to rush me. Ethan stared at him. He finds people, Dennis said simply. That's what he does. Some people are good at flying. He's good at finding the people who were built for it and who got lost. He looked at the citation. He found you through me. 32 years of closed loops. He paused. Marcus Webb flew with Whitfield's squadron for 1 month before he went to your unit. Did you know that? The coffee went cold in Ethan's hand. No, he said quietly. He did. Whitfield knew Marcus, which means this was never just about you, Carter. It was about all of it. The whole chain. He paused. When I texted him Monday, I wasn't just telling him I'd found a good pilot. I was telling him the chain wasn't broken. Ethan stood at the edge of the Whitmore ramp with his cold coffee and felt the day rearrange itself around him one more time. He'd thought Monday was a single event, a morning that went sideways, and then right again contained complete. He was understanding now that it wasn't contained. It never had been. It was connected to everything behind it, and everything ahead of it. The way a flight path is connected to its origin and its destination, even when you can only see the altitude you're currently at. He thought about what Liam had said at the bus stop. Would you be happy? He thought about Claire Webb. Maya would like that. He thought about Marcus, and the Mojave, and the silence on the radio, and the way he'd landed the crippled aircraft and walked away, and spent 6 years being ashamed of having walked away when Marcus didn't. He thought about something Sarah had said to him, not at the end, not in the hard months, but early. The first year they were together, when he was still flying test, and she was still learning what that meant for a partner. She'd asked him once, "What's it like?" Actually like not the movie version. And he'd told her the truth, which was that it was the purest form of being alive he'd ever found. Not because it was dangerous, but because it demanded complete presence, total attention. There was no room for anything else when you were threading 30,000 feet of clear air. No grief, no guilt, no past. Just now. Just now, he thought. That's what she always said. Be here. Actually, here. He'd been here for Liam. He had. Every morning, every dinner, every bedtime, every bus stop. And maybe, he could be here for this too. Not instead of. In addition to. He put his hand on the fuselage of the Citation Longitude. The same hand, the same position as Monday morning. Cool metal under his palm. "Dennis," he said. "Yeah. I'm going to need to get current in a few additional types. For the FAA program. The training starts in about 6 weeks." Dennis said nothing. He was very carefully not reacting, which was its own reaction. "I'll need somewhere to do the sim hours," Ethan said. "Whitmore has a Level D simulator at the training facility." "We do," Dennis said. "I'd like to use it. Off hours. I'll pay the hourly rate. Like to use." Dennis looked at him. "Ethan, you just saved this company's reputation in a single flight. You're consulting for us starting next week. I think we can manage the sim hours." Ethan shook his head. "I'll pay the rate. I want it clean, no favors." A pause. "Why?" "Because when I walk into that simulator, I want it to be because I earned the right to be there, not because someone owed me." He looked at the aircraft. "I spent 6 years being invisible because I was afraid of what being seen would cost. That's done. But I do it right, or I don't do it." Dennis looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded with the slow certainty of a man confirming something he already knew. "I'll set it up," he said. "Monday morning, 6 o'clock. Ethan's phone buzzed. He checked it. A text from a number he'd never seen before. Georgia area code different from Whitfield's. "Mr. Carter. My name is Ryan Webb. I think you knew my brother. I saw your name in the news yesterday. I don't want to intrude. But Marcus talked about you more than anyone. If you're ever willing to talk, no pressure. Either way. Ryan." Ethan read it twice. He looked up at the sky above the terminal. Pale blue high cirrus, the kind of day that looked simple from the ground and opened up into something enormous once you were inside it. He typed back Ryan. "I've wanted to talk to your family for 6 years. I just didn't know how to start. I'm glad you did. Ethan." He sent it. He put his phone in his pocket. He finished his cold coffee. And then, Ethan Carter, for the first time in 6 years, began to make a plan that included the sky. Not because the guilt was gone. It wasn't. It would probably never be fully gone, and he'd made a kind of peace with that, the way you make peace with a scar, not by forgetting it's there, but by understanding it's part of the map of who you are now, not who you were. Not because the fear was gone either. Fear of loss. Fear of being the one who came back again when someone else didn't. That lived in him like a pilot light, low and constant. He didn't expect it to go out. But Liam had asked him if he'd be happy. And he'd told the truth. And the truth, it turned out, had its own kind of gravity. It pulled you forward whether you were ready or not. He walked back through the access gate into the main terminal. Gate C7 was 20 yards away. His shift wasn't until tomorrow. He walked past it without stopping, which was something he'd never done before, and kept walking until he reached the large windows at the end of the concourse that looked out over the main runway complex. He stood there for 10 minutes. He watched the aircraft come and go, the big commercial birds on the main runways, the corporate jets cutting across on the parallel strip, the whole choreographed complexity of a major hub, operating at full capacity on a clear Thursday morning. He watched it the way a man watches something he belongs to. Then he went home. Yet, he had spaghetti to make. His son would be off the bus at 3:15, and he'd want to hear about the morning, and Ethan would tell him, not all of it, not yet, but enough. Enough for a 6-year-old to understand that his dad was going to fly again, and that it was going to be okay, and that the blue bag and the big meatballs weren't going anywhere. He was going to be here. He was going to be here, and he was going to fly. Both. At the same time. Just like Liam had always assumed was possible, because Liam hadn't spent 6 years learning to be afraid of wanting too much. Children were extraordinary. They really were. The simulator session on Monday morning started at 6 o'clock exactly. Ethan was there at 5:45, same as always, because being early was not a habit with him so much as a condition. The way some people's eyes adjusted slowly to light. His whole system adjusted slowly to stillness, and arriving early gave him the minutes he needed to settle into a space before the space had demands on him. The Whitmore training facility was attached to the private terminal, a low building that smelled like recycled air and electronics, and the specific industrial coffee that seemed to exist in every aviation facility he'd ever walked into, regardless of what city or what country or what branch of service. He poured a cup out of reflex and didn't drink it, and stood in front of the Level D simulator bay door with his hands around the cup and understood that he was stalling. He opened the door. The simulator looked exactly like what it was, a full-motion cockpit mounted on hydraulic actuators enclosed clinical the flight deck of a Cessna Citation, inside a metal box, inside a room. He'd logged hundreds of hours in devices exactly like this one back when logging hours had been his whole purpose. He'd been evaluated in simulators, certified in simulators, had pushed simulators to their limits on purpose to understand where the limits were and what happened when you crossed them. He climbed in. He strapped in. He ran the startup sequence from memory, and the instruments came alive around him, and the motion platform shifted subtly as the hydraulics pressurized that slight living quality that full-motion simulators had that distinguished them from the desktop versions, the sense that the machine was breathing. He sat there for 30 seconds without doing anything. Then he programmed the scenario. Standard departure from Atlanta. Clear weather. Light traffic. Nothing he couldn't manage in his sleep. He flew it perfectly, which told him nothing. He reprogrammed. Convective weather package. Left engine fluctuation at 8 miles. Marginal visibility. Savannah runway 10. He flew it again. The engine fluctuated at exactly the point he'd told it to, and his hands moved before the instrument registered the change the same way they'd moved on Monday, and he threaded the cell and landed smooth and sat in the parking position with the engines winding down and understood something that he'd been circling for a week without landing on it directly. He hadn't been lucky on Monday. He hadn't. He'd been trained. Trained so deeply and so thoroughly that 6 years of deliberate stillness hadn't touched the core of it. The skills were there, the same way the bones were there. Not something you maintained, something you were. The question hadn't been whether he could fly. The question had never been whether he could fly. The question had been whether he was allowed to want to. He reprogrammed again. This time he built the scenario that had actually killed Marcus. Not exactly, never exactly, because you couldn't exactly recreate the thing that happened once and then was over, but close enough in the parameters that his hands knew what they were doing and his mind knew what it was approaching. He sat in the ready position for a full minute. His hands were on the yoke and his eyes were on the instruments, and the simulator was holding its breath the same way he was. Then he flew it. He flew it the way he should have flown it that day in the Mojave, not differently, because the truth was that there was no version of that day he could have flown that would have changed the outcome for Marcus, and he'd known that for 6 years at an intellectual level, while his gut refused to accept it. He flew it with everything he had, all the skill, all the precision, all the ferocious attention he'd spent a career building. And when the scenario reached the moment where the aircraft entered unrecoverable parameters, he recovered it anyway. The way you recover things in a simulator that you can't recover in real life. And he brought it down clean on a virtual runway and sat there with his heart doing something loud in his chest, and his eyes burning in a way that had nothing to do with the recycled air. He sat there for 4 minutes. Then he climbed out, poured the cold coffee down the sink, made a fresh cup, and called Dennis Pryor at 7:19 in the morning. "I need the advanced meteorology module loaded for Wednesday's session," he said, when Dennis answered. A pause. "How was this morning?" "Load the module," Ethan said. "I'll see you Wednesday." He drove home, made Liam's lunch, walked him to the bus stop, came back and sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and the notebook that had Sarah's recipe in the margins, and he opened it to a blank page and wrote 3 words at the top. Start from here. 6 weeks moved fast when you had purpose to fill them. The FAA program's curriculum director was a woman named Dr. Patricia Okafor, who had 17 years in air safety research, a reputation in the industry for accepting nothing that wasn't evidence-based, and the sharpest questions Ethan had encountered since the debrief panels after test flights at Edwards. She interviewed him for 3 hours on a Tuesday in the FAA's Atlanta regional office, and at the end of it, she looked at him across the table and said, "You're going to be difficult to work with." "Why?" he said. "Because you know exactly what you're talking about, and people who know exactly what they're talking about have a hard time slowing down for people who don't." She looked at her notes. "And this program needs to be understandable to pilots with 200 hours, not just pilots who've flown experimental aircraft at 70,000 feet. I grew up on a farm in rural Ohio," Ethan said. "My father explained how a carburetor worked to me using a water pump and a garden hose. I know how to slow down." She looked at him over the rim of her glasses. "How old were you?" 6. "Did you understand it?" "Completely." She wrote something down. "You're hired," she said. "We start curriculum development in 3 weeks. Your first classroom session is in 6. I want the first module draft on my desk in 10 days. You'll have it in 8, he said. She looked up. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Promise faster than you can deliver." 8 days, he said. "I deliver what I promise." She studied him for a moment. Then she wrote something else down and closed the folder. "Fine, 8 days. If it's not on my desk." "It will be," he said. It was. 7 days and 14 hours to be precise, because he'd spent the better part of a week at the kitchen table after Liam was in bed building the framework from scratch, not adapting existing material, not reformatting what he'd seen in other programs, but building it the way you built anything that needed to last. From the foundation. He sent it to Dr. Okafor at 11:42 on a Wednesday night. She replied at 6 the next morning. "This is the best first module draft I've received in 11 years. You changed one thing I'm going to push back on in our Thursday call. Everything else is approved." He read the email at 5:30 at the kitchen window with his coffee. He read it twice. Then he put the phone down and watched the landing lights sweep the dark sky and felt something he'd almost forgotten the texture of. Pride. Clean, uncomplicated pride in work done well. It felt like coming home. The Thursday coffee with Whitfield became a standing thing, which neither of them formally decided, and neither of them mentioned it, simply continued to be true. The way certain things between certain people settle into place without requiring a ceremony. They met at the same corner table. Whitfield always arrived first. Ethan always arrived slightly early and found him there anyway. 4 weeks after the first meeting, Whitfield set his mug down in the middle of a conversation about the curriculum timeline and said, "Ryan Webb reached out to me." Ethan looked up. "I know, he told me. He wants to come to Atlanta." Whitfield watched him carefully. "Meet you in person." "I know that too." "And he's coming next Saturday," Ethan said. "He's bringing his mother." Whitfield was very still. "Claire is coming. And Maya." Ethan picked up his coffee. "I asked them. It seemed right. Liam's been asking about the picture of me and Marcus from Edwards, the one in the flight suit." He looked at the table. "I told him that was my best friend. He asked if he could meet him. I had to explain why he couldn't." He paused. "He asked if he could meet the family instead." Whitfield said nothing for a long moment. "6 years old," he finally said. "Not a question, just the weight of it." "He's a better person than I was at 35, Ethan said. Whitfield looked at him with an expression that was not quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. "Marcus would have loved that kid." "I know," Ethan said. "I've been thinking about that." And the Saturday visit arrived with the quiet inevitability of things that have been needed for a long time. Claire Webb was taller than Ethan had imagined. They'd only spoken on the phone, with Marcus's same direct quality of attention, that way of looking at you, like they were actually cataloging what they saw. Ryan was 28, darker than Marcus had been, quieter, with his brother's hands and a habit of listening carefully before he spoke that Ethan recognized as the kind of trait grief sometimes developed in people. And Maya. Maya was 5 years old, and she had Marcus's laugh. Claire had said so on the phone, and Ethan had registered it intellectually. But hearing it standing in his living room when Liam said something that struck her as funny, and the laugh came out of her, that specific, bright, unpredictable burst that Ethan could hear Marcus in completely, that was a different thing. He had to look away for a moment. Liam characteristically had no idea anything complicated had just happened, and was already showing Maya his crayon rocket ship collection with the systematic pride of a curator. Maya, equally characteristically for Marcus's daughter, was critiquing the aerodynamics. "That one's wings are too small," she said, pointing at a drawing. "They're not wings," Liam said with dignity. "It's a space rocket. It doesn't need wings. Everything needs wings, not space rockets." "My dad flew rockets," Maya said simply. Liam looked at her with sudden and total respect. "Real ones. Test ones, my mom said." Liam looked at Ethan across the room with an expression of pure wonder. Then he looked back at Maya. "My dad did too." The two of them looked at each other across the coffee table, with the serious gravity of children who have just discovered common ground and don't yet know what to do with it. Ethan stood in the doorway of his living room and watched the children of two pilots, one living, one gone, negotiate the terms of a friendship over crayon rockets, and felt something crack open in his chest in the best possible way. Claire came to stand beside him. She'd been watching too. "He would have wanted this," she said quietly. "I know," Ethan said, and this time he meant it completely, not as a thing people said, not as a comfort, as a fact about Marcus Webb that he had known for 6 years and had been too afraid to act on. "I'm sorry it took me so long," he said. She looked at him sideways. "You're here now?" "Yes." Then that's when it was supposed to happen, she said with the simple conviction of a woman who had rebuilt her life from the foundation up and knew something about the architecture of timing. They watched the children argue about rocket wings for another minute. Then Ryan came in from the kitchen with 4 mugs of coffee he'd made without being asked, and the afternoon settled into something that felt like the beginning of something rather than the end of anything, which was exactly what Ethan had been too afraid to hope for. The first classroom session of the FAA Advanced Weather Operations Program happened on a Tuesday morning, 43 days after Ethan had walked into a Whitmore aviation crisis in a maintenance uniform and walked out of it as something else. There were 22 pilots in the room. Commercial airline captains, corporate pilots, 2 regional carrier first officers working toward their ATP. The youngest was 26. The oldest was 51. A Delta captain named Kowalski, who had 30 years in the seat and the specific expression of a man who has agreed to attend a training he doesn't think he needs. Ethan stood at the front of the room in a plain dark shirt and no insignia of any kind and looked at the 22 of them. He said, 6 weeks ago, I flew a corporate jet through a convective cell with a fluctuating engine at 8 nautical miles from the field in marginal conditions. I'm going to tell you exactly what I did and why. And then we're going to spend the next 3 days talking about everything that could have gone differently. He paused. Not everything that could have gone wrong. Everything that could have gone differently. There's a distinction, and it matters. Kowalski uncrossed his arms. It was a small movement, barely visible. But Ethan had spent a career reading instrument panels that communicated in millimeters, and he read it. I'm also going to tell you about a flight I didn't fly correctly, Ethan said. One that cost a better pilot than me his life. Because the whole point of this program is not to teach you what to do when everything is fine. It's to teach you what to do when it isn't, and more importantly, what the difference feels like before you're already inside it. The room was completely quiet. He started talking, and he talked about weather, and he talked about decision-making, and he talked about the gap between what the instruments show you and what is actually happening outside the aircraft. He talked about the Mojave without using Marcus's name, that would come later, when the group had the context to understand what it meant, and he talked about Savannah with the engine fluctuation and the convective cell and the specific sequence of decisions that had kept 22,000 pounds of aircraft and 6 human lives intact. Wow. He talked for 2 hours. At the break, Kowalski came to the front of the room. He stood in front of Ethan and said nothing for a moment in the way men his age sometimes communicated the silence doing most of the work. Then, I've been flying 30 years. I've sat through mandatory safety training probably 60, 70 times. He paused. I've never once taken notes. He held up a legal pad. Full. I've got a flight tomorrow, he said. Atlanta to Denver. Weather package is showing some convective activity over western Kansas. He looked at Ethan steadily. What would you look for that the standard briefing would miss? Ethan looked at the legal pad. At the 30 years in Kowalski's face. At the specific quality of a man who has decided to learn something. He'd arrived believing he already knew which was the hardest and most important decision a person could make. Get your briefing material, Ethan said. Let's look at it together. They stood at the front of the empty room for 20 minutes. Kowalski's flight briefing spread across the table. Ethan walking him through the pressure gradients and the moisture boundaries and the things that the standard products showed and the things they didn't. Not teaching. Talking. The way pilots talk when they're being honest about what they know and what they're still figuring out. When the other participants started filtering back in, Kowalski gathered his papers and started toward his seat. One more thing, Ethan said. Kowalski stopped. Western Kansas. If you hit convective activity that's moved faster than the forecast, and it will have don't thread it. Go around. The extra fuel and the extra time are not a sign that the weather won. They're a sign you read it right. Kowalski looked at him. What if I'm tight on fuel margins? Then you should have filed more fuel, Ethan said. Not harsh, just direct. That's a pre-flight problem, not an in-flight problem. Kowalski was quiet for a second. Then he nodded, once the decisive nod of a man revising something he's been doing for 30 years. He went and sat down. Ethan looked at the room, 22 pilots giving him their full attention. Legal pads out, a room full of experience that had shown up with the willingness to be changed and felt the specific gravity of standing in a place where you are exactly what you're supposed to be. He thought about the tarmac at Gate C7, the invisible life, the carefully maintained disappearance. He thought about Liam at the bus stop. Would you be happy? Yes, he thought. He was. 3 days after the first classroom session, Vanessa Whitmore called him at 7 in the morning. He answered on the first ring, which surprised him when he noticed it. A week ago, he would have let it ring twice out of principle. My father died yesterday, she said. He sat down at the kitchen table. I'm sorry, Vanessa. He was awake at the end. He knew me. She was quiet for a moment. He told me something I've been thinking about since. He said he'd been watching the news and he'd seen the story about the flight, and he said... She stopped. When she continued, her voice was controlled but barely. He said he was proud of me for letting someone help me. He said that was the hardest thing I'd ever learned to do. Ethan sat with that. He was right, she said. I've been running things alone since I was 29. I built Whitmore from a 2-aircraft charter operation. I've never once... She stopped again. I laughed at you in front of my people because somewhere in the way I've built my life, I stopped being able to see people. I started seeing categories, uniforms, positions. Her voice steadied. My father saw people. He always saw people. I don't know when I stopped. You stopped when stopping felt like survival, Ethan said. That's usually when it happens. She was quiet. You saw me before we landed, he said. On the aircraft when you came to the cockpit. You were already seeing me then. Too late. No, he said. Right on time. That's the other thing. Things happen when they're supposed to, not when we think they should. He paused. Claire Webb said that to me on Saturday. I'm still deciding if I believe it, but it's been sitting with me. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. Marcus Webb's wife. Yes. She absorbed that. You're putting the pieces back together. Trying. Your son helped. He always does, Ethan said. He doesn't know that yet. He will when he's older. She took a breath. The board meeting is next Friday. They're voting on the restructuring proposal. I need the consulting report before then, not because of the board. Because I want to walk in there knowing the operation is what I believe it is. I want someone I trust to tell me if it isn't. Meh. He'd been working on the Whitmore operational review for 2 weeks. He'd gone through their safety protocols, their pilot training records, their weather decision framework, their maintenance logs. He'd interviewed 6 of their line pilots and 3 of the maintenance crew. He'd sat in on 2 pre-flight briefings. What he'd found was not what he'd expected. The operation was good, not perfect. There were 2 procedural gaps in the weather decision matrix that he'd already flagged to Dennis, but the foundation was genuinely sound. The pilots were well trained. The maintenance culture was strong. Whatever trouble Whitmore Aviation was in financially, it wasn't because the operation was broken. I'll have it to you Thursday morning, he said. The operation is solid, Vanessa. I want you to walk into that board meeting knowing that. She exhaled. It was a long exhale, the kind that's been held for a while. Thank you. Stop thanking me. I'll stop when I'm done, she said. I haven't said it enough yet. He let that stand. One more thing, she said. The board asked me as part of the restructuring presentation to provide evidence of operational excellence, something concrete, a case study. She paused. I'd like to present the Savannah flight. The audio, the ATC, logs the approach records, as an example of the standard I intend to hold this operation to. Ethan was quiet. Not as a story, she said quickly. Not as I'm not trying to make you a marketing instrument. I want to show them what this company does when it's working the way it should. You were an extension of this operation that day, even if neither of us knew it at the time. He thought about what Dennis had said. The chain isn't broken. Use it, he said, on one condition. Name it. Include the engine fluctuation, the full precautionary declaration. Don't clean it up. He paused. Show them the actual flight, not the highlight reel. The decisions that worked include the decisions that acknowledged risk. That's what operational excellence actually looks like. Silence. You're going to be the most honest consultant I've ever hired, she said. Yes, he agreed. That's the job. The board meeting was on a Friday. Ethan wasn't there. It wasn't his meeting, wasn't his company, and he had a classroom session that morning that he wouldn't have canceled for anything. He taught. He answered questions. He ran 2 pilots through a weather avoidance scenario in the simulator at noon, and debriefed them for 45 minutes afterward, sitting in the small room off the sim bay with their flight data printed out and spread between them, talking through every decision point, the way a surgeon talks through a procedure, not to assign blame, but to build understanding. At 2:15, his phone buzzed. A text from Vanessa. They approved the restructuring. 2 new contracts signed before we left the room. The Savannah audio played in the boardroom and no one said a word for 30 seconds after it ended. Then the chairman said, and I'm quoting exactly, "That's the company I invested in. Thought you should know." He read it at the end of the debrief, after the 2 pilots had gathered their materials and headed out. He read it, sitting alone in the small room with the flight data spread in front of him. He typed back, "Good. Now make sure the weather decision matrix gets updated before the next scheduled flight." Her reply came in 4 seconds. "Already done. Dennis sent me the revised protocol this morning." He put the phone down. He gathered the flight data into a folder. He labeled it. He filed it in the growing stack of case study materials he was building for future sessions. Real flights, real decisions, real outcomes. The library of actual events that would eventually teach things that no textbook scenario could replicate. He stood up. He stretched. He looked at the clock, 2:23. Liam would be off the bus at 3:15. He had 52 minutes. He used 40 of them to drive home, park the truck, and sit at the kitchen table with the notebook that had Sarah's recipe in the margins, and a cup of coffee, and the specific quiet of a house that would be loud again in 12 minutes. He opened the notebook to the blank page where he'd written, "Start from here." Below it, he wrote something else. He wrote Marcus's name. He'd never written it down before. In 6 years, he'd thought it 10,000 times and written it 0 times because writing it felt permanent in a way that thinking it didn't, and permanent felt like something he hadn't been ready to own. He wrote it now. Marcus Webb. Best pilot I ever flew with. Best friend I ever had. He would have been 42 this year. His daughter argues about rocket aerodynamics with my son. She has his laugh. I'm going to make sure she knows that. He closed the notebook. He heard the bus 2 streets over, that specific wheezing deceleration. He knew the way. He knew engine sounds, the way you learn the sounds of things that matter. He stood up. May. He walked to the door and opened it before Liam could reach the handle, and Liam came up the porch steps with his blue bag and his good sneakers, and the afternoon energy of a child who has been sitting still for 7 hours and is ready to be in motion again. And he walked straight into Ethan without slowing down, the way he always did, the automatic collision of a child who has never once doubted whether the person at the door would be there. Ethan caught him. He always caught him. "How was school?" Ethan asked. "Cooper wore the wrong sneakers today," Liam reported gravely. "So that's resolved." "Good. And we learned about clouds." Ethan looked down at him. Yeah, cumulonimbus." He said it carefully, each syllable a small achievement. "Those are the scary ones." "They are," Ethan said. "Do you know those ones from flying?" "I know those ones very well." Liam looked up at him with the focused curiosity he brought to important questions. Are you scared of them? Ethan crouched down, eye level, the way Sarah had taught him. Yeah, he said, the right amount. Liam considered this. What's the right amount? Enough to respect them, Ethan said. Not enough to stop flying. Liam nodded slowly, processing this with the gravity it deserved. Then something lighter moved across his face the way weather moved, quick total transforming. Can we have spaghetti? He said. Ethan stood up. He put his hand on his son's shoulder, small, specific, entirely his, and steered him toward the door. Yes, he said. Big meatballs. Obviously, Liam said and went inside. Ethan stood on the porch for one more moment. Above the houses, above the Atlanta skyline, above the approach corridors where the aircraft came and went in their patient, endless cycles. The late afternoon sky was doing what late afternoon skies do, turning colors. It had no business being a whole spectrum of gold and copper and the specific deep blue that lived at the edge of things, the blue that you only saw from 38,000 feet if you knew to look for it. He looked for it. He found it. He went inside. And in the kitchen of a small house in Atlanta, a man who had hidden himself from the sky for 6 years made spaghetti for his son and signed his name to the things that mattered and flew. Not because the grief was gone, not because the fear had left him, not because the past had released its hold on the present, but because his son had asked him a question at a bus stop and he had told the truth, and the truth turned out to be the only instrument he'd ever actually needed. The man everyone had laughed at. The man in the maintenance uniform at the bottom of the boarding stairs. The man who had simply been waiting for the morning when hiding cost more than living. That man flew. And the sky patient enormous, indifferent to pride and prejudice, and the uniforms people wear when they are afraid of being seen. The sky received him back without question, without ceremony, without a single word about how long he'd been gone, because the sky always knew. It had always known. It had just been waiting for him to remember.